CASA have been doing these wet season presentations for a number of years now. They kind of fell away a little during COVID, but we're certainly back on. We're back up and running. My name's Tim Penney. I'm an aviation safety advisor. I work down in the Melbourne office of CASA, down in the southern region. Thanks for giving us your time this afternoon. I understand that a lot of us are quite busy. Many of us have businesses to run and flights to accomplish and all of those types of things. So we certainly thank you for your time. We have Kirsty Winter, my colleague based in Brisbane. She's moderating today, and she'll be able to, as we go through, join me and type in responses or answers to questions and that type of thing as we go. We intend to have a question and answer session or discussion time at the end of today's presentation. So without any further ado, what I'll do is I'll go through the agenda because we are joined today by a number of guest speakers from industry and a number of our safety agencies who will add value to what we're talking about this afternoon with regards to operating in the wet seasons. And you can see their icons on the bottom of our header screen, which you should be able to see right in front of you. So the agenda for today, and I hope everyone can see that the screen has flicked over, is I'll start off with a quick 10-minute chat on some basic wet season information, just to really set the scene. And then really the large part of this afternoon is handing over to our industry experts. So I'll hand over to Michael after I've spoken. Michael Paech is a senior aviation meteorologist. He's based at the Bureau of Meteorology in Brisbane. Then Dean Jones, who works for the Australian Maritime Safety Authority up in Cairns. He's a senior officer for standards up there in the northeast of Australia. Following on from Dean, we're going to hear from Airservices Australia. We have a guest speaker, Leanne Costin, who is Director of Operations for primary towers in the northern part of the country. And then Jason Wicksteed. Jason's a pilot with Cobham and has many wet seasons under his belt as a pilot in command of everything from Cessna 210s all the way up to the Challenger aircraft flying for AMSA. Then we have that question and answer session at the end where it's a good opportunity to have some discussion, where it's really your chance to address any questions or comments to our industry representatives and our subject matter experts. We've entitled this presentation, you know, our wet season presentation for this year, but with specifically a focus on planning for safety. Because each year, a lot of young pilots do head north in search of work and greater experience in their logbooks to start their careers. And many of these pilots have never flown into or perhaps even let alone seen a Northern Australian wet season before. That Northern Australia part of our country essentially extends from Cairns all the way westward across to Broome. Flying in the wet season brings a whole new set of hazards and risks that need to be, first of all, identified and managed. We've run a number of these wet season seminars over the years, and they've proven to be extremely popular. And the feedback that we get from these wet season seminars is that they are a very valuable opportunity for people just to have a bit of a think about what they can do as individuals and perhaps even also what companies can do to better prepare their pilots for wet season operations. Because flying around Victoria and New South Wales in a nice glass cockpit 172 is a lot different to dodging tropical thunderstorms and turbulence and the pressures that come with carrying passengers in freight, often into marginal strips with high humidity, temperatures up in the high 30s. It's a completely different world up in the northern parts of Australia. So planning, the ability to be disciplined with our planning in situations like this is absolutely vital, and it could essentially save your life. It's also important that we emphasise that pilots should, wherever they can, try and tap into the experience of more seasoned pilots that may have had a number of wet seasons under their belts. And for also some of the senior pilots or more experienced aviators that are joining us today, always be prepared to try and share your knowledge as well for your experiences that you may have had in the wet season, both good and bad. And all of us can hopefully maintain a commitment to always be at least learning. The stuff we're going to be chatting about today is certainly no silver bullet, but what it can do is hopefully start some conversations among pilots and operators in and around the crew room or at the bar after work about things that you can do to increase levels of safety flying in what is really a very challenging environment. And the more you can do on the ground, the better your chances of success in the air. Because flying in the wet season is extremely dynamic, the environment is always changing. We do emphasize the fact that we all need to have a plan B and a plan C, but most importantly, have the discipline and the professionalism to act on it. As aviators, we need to be humble, and we also have to guard against letting pride take over our decision making. Um, and really, the more planning we can do on the ground, the greater there is, or the greater the likelihood is that we're going to make rational, well thought out decisions. So, really, planning for safety, it goes back to that old saying, doesn't it? That failure to plan really is planning to fail. And there's many ways we can do this. But if we don't get this right or we don't do it at all, we do set ourselves up for failure. So CASA, through our AV safety seminars around the country, we've been pushing for quite a few years the PAVE, PAVE, the PAVE model. It's just one way of assisting in our planning. There's lots of other models out there like the I'm Safe checklist and all the rest of it, but it's just a useful tool that we can employ in the lead up to any flight, short or long, which helps gets our head in the right space and gets our thinking where it really needs to be. Um, and that type of thinking is more important than ever in the wet season, where there's a greater number of very unique hazards that we must manage. And like everything, this model is not a silver bullet, but it's part of your toolkit. What we can do is help our pilots and organisations think strategically and perhaps even a bit more deliberately about some of the hazards with wet season flyings and the risks that we're likely to face. But PAVE, basically it breaks our thinking down into pilot, aircraft, our environment that we fly in and around, and finally a big one, especially for the younger pilots, perhaps on their first or second job, external pressures, PAVE. We have this uh, uh, this aid memoir put in one of our flight planning toolkits that we have on the CASA website. There's a small laminated card in that toolkit. You can purchase or you can grab hold of this card from our CASA online store. And it basically breaks down to pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. And it's a really useful tool to assist with pre-flight decision making. The key word here is pre-flight. Okay, we need to have a really good knowledge of both the aircraft's limits and also our own personal limits before we go flying. So that's not a bad little thing for your toolkit. So let's break down our PAVE very quickly. I'm not going to steal the thunder of our guest speakers, but it's just some really good stuff to get you thinking. And of course, you will be able to access a copy of this presentation afterwards. So before flight, P is for pilot. The first thing really here is previous wet season experience. At the end of the day, we can't beat experience. So pilots with little or no experience really should try and seek the advice of those pilots that perhaps have had more wet seasons in their logbook. And organisations should actively try and utilise the knowledge of those experienced pilots within their ranks, and put in place systems whereby experienced pilots can mentor the young ones coming up for their first wet seasons. Other things that we need to consider in the pilot sphere. So we've got VFR or IFR. Much of this presentation is aimed at the VFR pilot, but there's also some really good stuff in here for the IFR pilot as well. Be aware that up in the north, hot, humid weather is actually fatiguing, okay, more so than down in the south. So we have to consider things like, for example, sleep may be difficult, dehydration and water intake. In hot, humid weather, we sweat a lot. We do lose a lot of water. So there are physiological effects that we need to be aware of when operating up north compared to just operating down here in the southern states. Other things to be aware of is even things like mood and behaviour, especially if you're not used to wet season weather, especially during that hot, humid build-up time, which we're really in the middle of now. And importantly for organisations is the importance of supervising or training of pilots that are new to wet season operations. You know, companies need to perhaps ask themselves questions. Are there procedures that we have in our do we have procedures in our operations manual that will assist us in mentoring young pilots new to Northern Australian operations? So that's just from the pilot perspective. Let's have a look now with regards to our aircraft. So A is for aircraft. First of all, is things like density height on aircraft performance. Okay. Make sure, for example, that we really know how to interpret performance charts. Be aware of the impact of density height on aircraft performance, because hot days combined with high humidity will increase the density altitude and your aircraft performance will suffer as a result. Other things to be aware of with the aircraft: greater holding requirements due to weather and fuel uplift. Um, Emphasize the importance of, for example, the often neglected alternate minima for VFR operations. It's obviously a very wet time of year up there, so things like fuel contamination, especially with drum stock at remote airfields, and we need to emphasise the importance of really good water contamination prevention and being extremely thorough with fuel drain procedures. Weather radar. Some aircraft may have weather radar, and that's all fine and beaut, but we need to ask ourselves the question: do we really know how to use our weather radar and also interpret it? And do we know its limitations? After weather radar, even things like securing of loose articles and cargo in turbulence. When CASA does a series of ramp checks across the northern parts of Australia, one of the consistent things we find uh, in our ramp checks is that pilots do go flying around, often in quite turbulent conditions, with cargo that is not adequately restrained. We need to be especially vigilant of things like that. And finally, unserviceabilities on the maintenance release. We need to think we're operating in an environment where perhaps we might be able to get away with unserviceabilities down in the southern states, but in the severe weather we're likely to, face it in front of us up north. Things like our minimum equipment list and unserviceabilities on our maintenance release take a whole new importance, and we need to give that increased amounts of attention. So that's the aircraft side of the house. So we've done P, we've done A. Let's go now to V. V for environment. And this is really where the rubber hits the road up there. The first thing is obviously thunderstorms and turbulence, both during the build up and in the wet season. And I'll let Michael talk more about that. But the Bureau of Met website has a fantastic knowledge centre in their aviation section with all sorts of fact sheets and bits and pieces on things like this. And I can't recommend it highly enough. But ask yourself the question: do I really actually know how to interpret both graphical area forecasts and terminal area forecasts? And if in doubt, then that's fine. Acknowledge that, but have the professionalism or the discipline and be humble enough to therefore go and take steps to refresh your knowledge, so you are full bottle on actually being able to interpret things like GAFs and terminal area forecasts. Other things with regards to the environment up there: convective cloud buildup, the potential, of course, for severe turbulence and wind shear, etc. And they can play havoc with you, especially when you have the windsock at one end of the runway showing a wind direction and strength completely different to the windsock at the other end of the runway. Higher probability of course, VFR into IMC. There's even things like last light considerations with extensive low-level cloud, where last light actually may come earlier than perhaps it might be listed in official documentation. All sorts of things that can catch us out with regards to the environment. What else do we have here? We've got using ATC wherever possible to assist in the safety of flight. And I'll let Leanne talk more about that when she talks in Airservices presentation. But use the tools that we have available. If you're inside controlled airspace, or even if you're outside controlled airspace, pilots need to feel that it's okay to ask for weather-related deviations to their flight path, especially when the safety of flight is concerned. Pilots should never, ever, ever be reluctant to use the words require. If requesting a clearance through controlled airspace or restricted airspace, either due weather or any other time that the safety of flight may be called into question. If you can't comply with an ATC clearance or instruction, then tell ATC immediately. And they are duty bound to give you an alternative, even if this might mean some type of delay either to your own or other aircraft. Because remember, people in ATC, they don't have the full appreciation of the actual weather where you are compared to being the pilot in command. They only have access to the same Bureau of Meteorology radar feed as the public does. So often, really, the pilot in command is the best source of weather information for ATC. And finally, other things like contaminated runways due to water and mud and debris, long grass that grows in the wet season can hide runway markers and all the rest of it. Other things to do with the environment. Cyclone season, just be at least aware of that, roughly from November to March, and companies should have at least some type of procedure in place to evacuate aircraft away from an approaching cyclone. Lack of infrastructure, especially in remote areas, and severe weather can wipe out infrastructure. Things like nav aids, repeaters, other pieces of infrastructure, fuel supplies, windsocks, etc. Limited mobile phone coverage, of course, is a no-brainer. Wildlife, debris on runways, and often traffic and lack of suitable alternates can suddenly turn small backwater remote airstrips into quite busy circuit environments as everyone runs for safety. And finally is external pressures, PAVE. External pressures, they are things that we really do need to consider when operating in the wet season, because there are lots of pressures on pilots and organisations. We need to acknowledge them and the fact that they are likely to come. The first one is there is pressure to service communities that might be cut off by things like floodwaters or closed roads, and that in itself can put insidious or even direct pressure on pilots and organisations. Pressure to complete the job and succeed, especially for the new pilot wanting to obviously impress the boss and complete the mission. We can easily find ourselves under pressure to try and outrun deteriorating weather to meet timelines, and that can turn very badly very quickly. Of course, it can be very tempting to try and outrun weather, especially on arrival or departure. But chatting to one of the experienced wet season pilots in the office down here, they said, look, if in many cases, if you're just prepared to wait 30 minutes or so, often you may have the thunderstorm cell move away, and then you can continue as normal. Pressure to stay within fatigue and duty times, even that's going to be a pressure, especially when we have to change our schedules and deal with weather delays and whatnot. And finally, there's always that temptation, isn't there, to take a charter job or to take some type of freight work to try and stay ahead of the competition, even though the weather itself might be marginal. So there's a lot of things there, isn't there, in PAVE, pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures that we need to consider. And finally, just before I hand over to Michael, I just want to talk very quickly about Special VFR. Special VFR is a tool that is often used by pilots to assist them getting into and out of control zones when the normal VMC criteria doesn't exist. But a lot of pilots do tend to, from my work around the country, they don't perhaps tend to fully understand what Special VFR actually is, what it means, and some of the issues that go with it. So just as a bit of a refresher, I've just got a few points on Special VFR. A Special VFR clearance must be pilot initiated. As a general rule, ATC will not initiate or offer a Special VFR clearance. It must be initiated by the pilot in command. They may issue a Special VFR clearance, usually only as long as IFR flights aren't going to be unduly delayed, because a Special VFR clearance will often take up quite a large amount of airspace for that Special VFR aircraft to remain clear of cloud and to have the requisite visibility. So they may issue you a Special VFR clearance, but only as long as you're not going to delay IFR operations. You can't get them at night. They're available by day only. And be aware of the VMC minima criteria that apply to a special VFR clearance. And as you can see there, the viz can come down to 1600 metres, and that's all fine and beaut. But if you're barreling along at 180 knots or 3 miles a minute, you eat up 1,600 metres of forward visibility very, very quickly. Okay. So that's not a lot of visibility. Special VFR, some other stuff about it, only available in the control zone or in adjacent controlled airspace for the purposes of you leaving or entering the control zone. It's not available for Class E airspace, okay? And remember, a special VFR clearance will require a pilot to be able to revert back to normal VMC criteria once they've departed the controlled airspace. So you can make use of that 1600 metres of visibility and clear of cloud when you're in controlled airspace in receipt of that clearance, but once you leave into Class G airspace, you are expected to be able to maintain normal VMC as would apply. And ultimately, it's really a last resort mitigation tool. We have to be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of automatically assuming that special VFR is always going to be available to us. So that's just a few quick dot points on the world of special VFR. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over before, I think I've got one more slide left. There's a nice thunderstorm for you, just brewing. A superior pilot uses their superior judgment to avoid situations which would require the use of their superior skill. Again, the more that we can pre-plan on the ground and have our contingencies in place, the less likely we are to have to demonstrate flying skills either at the edge of our personal envelope or at the edge of our aircraft's envelope. And that, I think, was a quote from one of the US NASA astronauts. So that was me. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to head over to Michael Paech. He's a senior aviation meteorologist with the Bureau based down in Brisbane. And Michael's just going to take us through a bit of a look-see at some of the typical weather and some of the hazards that we experience up there in the top end of Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for the welcome, Tim. As Tim mentioned, I'm a senior forecaster in the Brisbane Aviation Forecasting Centre, which is located in Brisbane. In that position, I oversee all the forecasts and warnings that come out from our forecasters across Northern Australia. So on this slide here, you can just see a QR code on the right-hand side. This is just one way of just getting some constructive feedback to us at the Bureau of Meteorology, whether that's about this presentation or indeed if it's about anything else aviation weather related, and that will pop up again on the last slide that I've got. Look, my job today is to briefly talk about the climate expectations for the wet season ahead. And then I'm going to discuss the two major hazards within the wet, which is being thunderstorms and the monsoon. Look, as you no doubt have heard, La Nina has been declared, being the third year in a row that this has occurred. Now, this is pretty unusual, having only occurred, I think, 2 other times in Bureau's recorded history. La Nina basically occurs when we get stronger than usual southeast trade winds across the Pacific, and that causes cold water to come to the surface way over in the east, over near Chile, while the southeast trade winds push the warmer water closer to Australia. And warmer waters means more water in the atmosphere, which in turn generally means that we get more rainfall. So the current La Nina means that we have an above average chance of receiving above average rainfall, and because it'd be more cloud about actually cooler days. Although it should just be noted that our climate people are currently saying that across the top end, we're actually forecasting like an average year for rainfall, even a possibly even below average year for rainfall. Having said that, across northern Queensland, we are expecting an above average season. On average, the wet season sees 3 tropical cyclones across the northern region, so that's off the Northern Territory, while a typical season sees 4 tropical cyclones in the eastern region, that is in Queensland waters. So typically you might get 1, maybe 2 that cross a coast each year, but look, each season is different. Because of the warmer waters, we do have an above average chance of getting more cyclones than usual, and perhaps even earlier cyclones than usual. But having said that, the same situation happened last year, and we had the opposite occur with less cyclones and a little bit later. So look, my main focus today is to look at the weather, the main weather hazards for aviation during the wet, that being thunderstorms and the monsoon. So let's just start by looking at what a normal wet season looks like. This is for the top end at this stage. We're currently in the build-up period. Tim mentioned that earlier, and this defines a period when like the heat and the humidity increases significantly, quite uncomfortably so, I'm sure you can all agree, and we start getting storms. And so we get the storms starting to occur. Similar for northern Queensland, where storms start to occur, we only get the occasional southeasterly wind surge with showers. Over the top end, the first monsoon usually occurs in December, although it can come later than that. Now, the monsoon is characterised by deep northwesterly winds. We get squally showers, lots of rain, and we actually see quite a drop in the daytime temperatures with all the cloud cover. And then once the first monsoon's done, from then on until the end of the season, we basically alternate between periods of the short periods of the monsoon and then breaks between the monsoon when you go back to mainly thunderstorm activity and humid weather once again. And it's also our tropical cyclone season, as Tim mentioned earlier. So look, let's get on to thunderstorms. So what is a thunderstorm? Look, it's pretty simple. It's basically just a cumulonimbus cloud, CB cloud, that produces lightning. And that really is the definition of a storm. Of course, there are a lot of associated weather that goes along with that. So what are the hazards to aviation with thunderstorms? Firstly, have to stress all thunderstorms are dangerous to pilots and aviation. So hazards can include like can't see, visibility due to rain. We get low cloud near and underneath a storm. You get hail strikes on airframes if you're down like southern regions and lightning strikes, as well as damage to infrastructure at airports. However, really the greatest, probably most life-threatening hazards come from severe turbulence in and around storms and strong wind shear. Firstly, up and down drafts in and around thunderstorms, look, they can be as great as like 6,000 feet per minute. Really strong up and down drafts, life-threateningly so. Secondly, wind direction and strength underneath and nearby a storm can rapidly change. I'd just like to illustrate that just with a diagram. So if you can visualize, as on this screen here, you can visualize an aircraft on final approach. Storm ahead of it. It's got a really strong headwind due to that. There's a storm ahead with a gust front coming past. But as the gust front passes, those strong headwinds suddenly become strong tailwinds. The difference in the wind shear. So in some storms, we're talking about wind shear in excess of even 50 or 60 knots. So that sudden loss in airflow over the wing, substantial loss of lift, obviously is not a good factor and actually has led to several fatalities around the world in and around storms. So look, mostly due to this factor, the recommendation is stay as far away as you can from thunderstorms. Look, I can tell you a story about some Air Force pilots out of the Ambley Air Base down my way and a cranky lady from northern New South Wales. But look, probably time precludes me from that just at the moment. But maybe if we get time at the end, we'll see how we go. Okay, so look, how do we at the Bureau go about forecasting thunderstorms? We refer to the thunderstorm tripod. There are three factors that are required for thunderstorms to form. Firstly, we need a moist atmosphere. We need humidity in the atmosphere because without moisture, clouds can't form. So that one's a bit of an obvious requirement. Secondly, we need an unstable atmosphere, which means that air wants to rise and rise rapidly. Now, an unstable atmosphere is one where there is cold air above the ground. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, getting cold air on a hot day, but if you remember basic school physics where you learnt that hot air rises, you might imagine we've got some hot air close to the ground, so it rises, but then it encounters this cold air that's above the ground. And so it's warmer, so it wants to continue to rise and quite significantly so. So that's what it means to have an unstable atmosphere. The air wants to go up. And the last element we look for is a trigger. That is something to get the air going up in the first place. So we look at a number of things which I'll go through shortly. Now, the forecasts you see on the GAF, they're often quite widespread and broad brushed on the GAF. That's a result of our analysis of the situation, and where we see all of these three factors occurring. And so that's where we're going to put stuff on the GAF. Now, look, once storms are up and going, look, they rarely stay stationary. They actually move. And they're moved around by the winds that are typically between 5,000 feet and maybe 20,000 feet. It's because these clouds are so tall, like in the tropics, normally well over 45,000 feet high. They're not going to be steered around by winds at the surface, but they're actually going to be steered around by the winds that are aloft. And things get even more complicated in the tropics once storms are happening. And look, everything changes once a large storm goes through. Downdrafts from storms bring huge amounts of cold air to the ground. And just think about your own experiences, like the cooling effect you get once a storm's gone through. And so that's all this cold air, stable air being brought to the ground. So that often means that once large storms have gone through, the atmosphere might be suppressed, even for anything up to even 24 hours. And that's a big deal, particularly if you're flying in and around Darwin. It has a big impact. So if we get a decent storm through Darwin in the morning, then often we got very little chance of getting anything for the rest of the day. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just going through some local information, mostly about the top end, but first just around about North Queensland. Just to give you a bit of, I guess, insight of what we're looking at. Look, around North Queensland, topography is really important for storms to start. So when air comes or encounters a mountain range, it's forced upwards. And there's our trigger. We've got air going up, and so that's that gets our storms to start. So ranges that we look at, which often see storms start, are the Atherton tableland, which is just inland from Cairns. That extends from like Ravenshoe to the south, almost up to Cooktown in the north. Other significant topography includes the Gregory Ranges, which is well inland from Townsville, also the Harvey Range, which is close to Townsville, and even over near Mount Isa, there's a bit of a range out there, the Selwyn Range, which can trigger off some storms. Now, the sea breeze is a really important trigger around northern Queensland, particularly around the Cape York Peninsula, the coastline there. If you can imagine, as a sea breeze pushes inland, it runs into air that's already there, and that forces that air to go up. And there's our trigger again. We've got air going up. So places like, if you can see my mouse there, like places up here at Weipa, further down the coast at Cowan-Yarma, Normanton. In fact, there was a storm at Normanton about an hour ago caused by the sea breeze. Burketown over here. All these places along here are places that normally get storms that are triggered by the sea breeze front. Finally, over water at night, it's probably more likely to get storms over water at night time. So places like Horn Island and the Torres Strait, even Lockhart River, are more likely to get nighttime storms. Okay, let's go to the top end now. Basically, it's always unstable. It's with so much moisture around, so much instability around all the way through the build up and the monsoon break. It only just takes the tiniest little trigger for a storm to materialize out of nowhere. So 1 minute you've got barely a cloud in the sky, then 20 to 30 minutes we have a full-on thunderstorm. If you do fly up here, you will get to know Hector the convector. So Hector is the name given to the almost daily storm that forms over the Tiwi Islands due to sea breezes from different parts of the island. So in here, and you can see this storm easily from Darwin. It's happening right now. It's happening now, and you can actually see it from Darwin at the moment, although there might be a bit too much cloud around. Topography is less important in the top end because there's just not as much as higher ranges as North Queensland, but the sea breeze is a major cause of storm. So just in and around the coast, mostly around the north through Maningrida, Elcho Island and so on. Gove is always a little bit problematic because you've got competing sea breezes around that little peninsula there, and we see storms kick up just inland from Gove pretty regularly. Whether it actually gets to Gove is debatable, but it will always probably impact at least your final approach into that airport. Also down the west coast, down to Port Keats, Wadeye, and of course into Darwin itself. So Gulf lines are also an important consideration over the top end. Now, Gulf lines actually start way over on Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, and that starts in the afternoon when storms go up on the west coast of Queensland on Cape York Peninsula, and this wave of instability then progresses across the Gulf of Carpentaria through the evening. And the next morning, and finally the Gulf line would often arrive around Gove or Nhulunbuy, normally about noon the next day. So it started over in Queensland the previous afternoon, makes its way across, gets to maybe Nhulunbuy, Gove by the middle of the day, and then it continues across the top end through the evening. In fact, it often gets to Darwin around about like 17 to 21 Zulu in the morning, and can fire up a storm there. So that's an important consideration, especially if you're doing some nighttime flying around the top end. Now, while I'm on Darwin, climatology has most storms occurring the time I just mentioned, the 17 to 21 Zulu time due to the Gulf lines, but then again, mostly between 03 to 09 Zulu during the day. As you know, if you live there, like, it doesn't have to be that time, but that's probably climatologically the most usual time. And the normal situation is for the sea breeze to push through Darwin. Storms can fire on this sea breeze front, and then the winds try to push the storms back towards Darwin. If you are unlucky, on some days storms can fire up right over the airport as the sea breeze goes through, although the more normal situation is that they normally form inland. Okay, let's talk the monsoon. Remember, that normally starts maybe mid to late December, a little bit later. The monsoon occurs when we've got air from the northern hemisphere, crosses the equator, and then turns northwesterly and heads towards Australia. So it's gone over a lot of warm, moist water. It's got lots of water in the atmosphere, and then it goes into this area that forms called the monsoon trough through there. And so we normally get these northwesterly winds pushing into this monsoon trough. We've got southeasterly trades to the south, and so we've got this massive area of convergence where we can actually see tropical cyclones form and lots of storms as well. But if you're going in the monsoon itself, what you're expecting is really extended days of rain, extended days of squally showers, and just the odd thunderstorm. And I say these conditions can last for anywhere from one day to a week or so. The aviation risks are fairly obvious. You've got potential very poor visibility for many days, low cloud, turbulence, and wind gusts.
Just very quickly, sorry, Michael, just very quickly, what about Broome? Similar to Darwin with regards to their wet season?
Look, Broome is a little bit different. I mean, it's still within the wet season. The difference with Broome with their storms, they can get it on the sea breeze front. They can also, depending on the steering, they can actually get storms late in the night with storms that form well inland, even over in the Northern Territory, and then just march as a squall line towards Broome over the evening. And often into the early morning as well. But yeah, in terms of sea breeze, yeah, Broome is very susceptible to the sea breeze coming in, popping storms up. It's a bit hard to see in the map there, but right on the Dampier Peninsula itself in the middle there, and try to get back towards Broome. Just some local considerations for Darwin. Again, just when we are within the monsoon, you're more likely to get embedded storms coming off the Timor Sea at night time. But even so, there's probably only prob 30, and daytime and into the evening, you're more likely to see lots of squally showers and potential for rain. Finally, but probably one of the more important messages I would like to get across today is about communication with forecasters at the Bureau of Meteorology. Look, while the wet season does bring an increase in workload for forecasters, it's also the time where we add the greatest value, I think, to keeping pilots safe, as well as allowing continuing operations for companies and operators. Look, we are always available to be contacted if you need, and you find the number to call us. It's on the bottom left-hand side of the gaff. If you use that number, we're there to help and assist. It's not a media number. Okay, the number on the gaff puts you in contact with the actual forecaster who is writing and looking after all your forecasts and monitoring them all the time. So look, if you've read the forecasts from NAIPS, you've interpreted them, but you need more information. Okay, I need a little bit of extra clarification on the gaff, or what's a current state of play? Have I got fog here? Or sorry, that's probably more a dry season thing. But where are the thunderstorms mostly firing up right now? You can give us a call to get a bit of a briefing on that. And look, we regularly do get calls, and we appreciate that people are wanting some extra information, and we do encourage that. I have listed at the bottom of this slide just where our handover times are. I mention those because if you do need to contact us during that time, that's fine. You'll always get somebody to talk to, but it's also the time that we're in the middle of handover from one forecaster to another, and then the new forecaster is trying to get up to speed and analyse things and get going for the shift ahead. So look, a lot of information there, and I have gone through fairly quickly, but again, happy to take questions at the end. And again, there's the QR control code there if you need to, or you'd like to get some more feedback to us. Thanks, Tim.
Lovely. No, thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Look, the guys and gals at the Bureau of Meteorology are always wonderful, always available, and they're certainly worth a phone call, and more than willing to help. So thank you, Michael. I might just advance the slide now to Dean. Dean is a Senior Standards Officer working with the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. Dean is based in Cairns. And I'll hand over to Dean now, and he can give us the AMSA view of the world when it comes to the wet season. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks very much, Tim. So just going quickly over the topics I'll be covering today. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about AMSA's search and rescue, or SAR, system and function. Then I'll talk a little bit about SAR taskings, stores delivery, and the impacts that may be encountered during the wet season. I'll then talk a little bit about emergency beacons, aircraft homing to a beacon's location, and what impacts, again, the wet season or adverse weather can have on locating a beacon with an aircraft. And I'll close off the presentation with a few outgoing messages. So generally, it's a presentation about what happens when something has already gone wrong, but keeping in mind that many SAR incidents don't happen in perfect weather. So on to a very brief overview of AMSA's national SAR system. So as part of the AMSA Response Centre, we have the Joint Rescue Coordination Centre, which is located in Canberra. The centre operates 24 hours a day, 365 days per year, as you might expect. And within the centre, we have two main sections that work side by side in collaboration, depending on the SAR tasking. One of which is the section for the Maritime SAR officers, and the other is containing the Aviation SAR officers. So here we have a graphic of Australia's search and rescue region. This is the area for which Australia has taken responsibility for the coordination of search and rescue. It covers a very large area, as you can see. It's approximately 11% of the Earth's surface, which equates to about 53 million square kilometres. So you might ask, how does AMSA service this search and rescue region? So in response to our national obligation to cover the search and rescue region, AMSA has contracted the use of 4 drop-capable Challenger 604s, which are heavily modified for SAR operations. So these aircraft are located in Cairns, Melbourne and Perth, and are capable of dropping various life-saving items, including life rafts, dewatering pumps, flares, and multi-purpose containers, which could be configured to contain whatever may be necessary for a SAR incident. As you can see on the slide, the suite of sensors includes a search radar, electronic optics and infrared, MVGs for the crew, VIDAR, which is visual detection and ranging, and a satellite data link for onboard internet. So AMSA SAR function with wet season considerations. So with the dynamic and unpredictable nature of aviation SAR, adverse weather obviously threatens to impact a number of factors involved in a search. So first off, of course, is safety. Both AMSA and task crews conduct frequent risk assessments, including with the initial tasking, and once the asset is operating within the search area, as well as the SAR situation itself evolves. So for offshore rotary SAR or medevac operations, AMSA may advance the decision to provide top cover if there is particularly bad weather. And for those who may not know, for a top cover job, AMSA will task the Challenger to maintain watch of another asset overhead in the unlikely event that a rotary asset may experience issues while offshore. Wet season considerations for search integrity. Obviously, adverse weather threatens to obscure the visibility of the air search observers. It may create the need to amend the search altitude to a less than ideal level for the search being conducted. And just like for the observers, weather can obstruct the sensors such as electronic optics or reduce the detectability of the search radar when searching offshore. As far as managing asset expectations, when coordinating a search, AMSA needs to manage their expectations of what will realistically be achievable within the search area, and they need to plan accordingly. So for a few examples, these considerations could be related to general flight planning, non-ideal or distant alternates, tempos and inters, and access to fuel, particularly in remote areas for rotary aircraft. So these factors affect time on scene, and they can have a huge impact on the asset's time on scene in the search area. So when multiple weather factors are at play, it can have a tremendous outcome on the effectiveness of an operation as a whole. And there are also search pattern considerations in bad weather or during the wet season. Limited time on scene and weather conditions may require the need for altering the length or size of a search pattern, or even change the type of pattern being conducted itself. And of course, it affects surface assets as well on land. So even when a SAR target has been found, access to the location can be difficult as a result of factors on the slide there, such as flooding, road closure, rotary extraction, and the logistics surrounding rotary extraction as well. So moving on to stores delivery considerations during adverse weather. So a risk assessment again, as per the previous slide. Risk assessments are carried out continuously throughout an operation, but are also a procedure for considering stores delivery. For example, a consideration may be whether or not an intended drop zone is clear and safe to drop to. And you also have to ask, can it be cleared at all if there is low cloud obstructing it? Identifying the target and nature of distress. The aircraft may have the location of a beacon but cannot confirm the target or their nature of distress. If we don't know the nature of distress, how do we know what type of stores need to be delivered? And also altitude. What altitude is achievable for the dispatch of stores? And considerations around this may include whether or not the target actually sights the stores once they leave the aircraft. Also, if the altitude has to be adjusted to get into the area, what is the likelihood of an accurate drop in areas of high winds and where you're dropping at high altitude? The next topic is distress beacons. So when I say distress beacon, what I mean is either an EPIRB, PLB, or an ELT. So it could be any of those three. So as you can see, here are some statistics for 2021. These are statistics on beacon activations. So as you can see, we had a total beacon activations number of 2,066, with 318 of those being confirmed distress alerts, 1,065 of those being confirmed false alerts, and 683 which were deemed undetermined. So you can see from those statistics that the actual distress alerts represent about 15% of the total alerts received at the JRCC for that year. And since 683 activations fell under the category of undetermined, combined with the confirmed false alerts at 1,065, we can see that the false alerts represent the vast majority of the alerts received by AMSA. And later on, you'll actually see at the bottom of a slide a crew member in a rubbish tip. So that's not actually an uncommon event where we will have a helicopter land nearby and actually meet with managers at a rubbish tip and actually do a ground home to try and locate the beacon. So further on the topic of distress beacons, this one a bit more specifically during the wet season, I wanted to talk briefly on how SAR aircraft home to the location of a distress beacon and some of the considerations that may need to be taken into account during the wet season. So not all beacons that are activated are newer models. For example, beacons with GPS encoding. Not all beacons are also in the best condition, and also they may not be located in the most ideal location for a homing, which would be an open area free from shielding or reflection. So when AMSA tasks an asset to a beacon homing, we pass on the best known location of the beacon based on the satellite data we've received. The aircraft will then head out to that location and listen for the beacon's transmission. When the beacon is heard on the aircraft's direction finder, the aircraft will conduct a homing on the beacon's locations. So when I say direction finder, if you haven't seen one fitted to an aircraft before, think of the direction finder like a handheld compass, except rather than the needle pointing to the north, it points to the source of the transmission. So the aircraft will fly to the heading or on the heading indicated by the needle on the direction finder until the needle flicks 180 degrees, indicating that the aircraft has overflown the beacon. This is also known as station passage. So things that are problematic to beacon homing during the wet season. Adverse weather may inhibit some aircraft types, such as rotary or non-pressurized aircraft, from being able to directly overfly the beacon, making it impossible to achieve accurate positioning based on this method. And even just cloud cover of the area where the beacon is located may prevent a homing to be conducted at a lower altitude, which is generally preferred for accuracy. And it also eliminates the ability or possibly eliminates the ability to confirm the SAR target while you're overflying. However, an accurate lower safe or high altitude homing can be achieved, but it's providing a couple of caveats. It's provided that the beacon has a clear vertical line of sight with the transmission propagation. It's provided the beacon is situated in an open space to prevent or reduce terrain reflection or shielding. What this will essentially do is if we have shielding, it can give false indications as multiple signals bounce off objects surrounding it. It also provides that the beacon is in good condition and that it has a good battery. And on the slide there, I've got within expiry date to sort of encapsulate that. And finally, it should also be noted that a more modern 406 beacon that is also GPS encoded will provide a much more accurate datum to AMSA. I believe the most modern 406 GPS encoded beacons will define a position within about 10 meters. So that way it's doing most of the work for us. And I'll just go through some quick outgoing messages to conclude my presentation. On the topic of beacon registration, some of this goes without saying, but ensure your beacon is registered. And it only takes a few minutes online these days. If you go to the AMSA registration portal, it won't take long at all, and it's well worth doing. And of course, keep your details updated, particularly with transfer of ownership. We have had cases where a beacon will go off, it's been registered, we'll have all the name and details of the person, we'll call up them. If they don't answer, the family might pick up and they'll let us know that, no, we sold that beacon with the boat a year ago. So it's important to keep it up to date. Ensure of correct disposal. The details of these locations are online for each state. This avoids the situation that we have on this slide here with someone sorting through a rubbish tip looking for one. One for pilots, monitor 121.5 megahertz when you can, and that will assist in helping us locate a beacon, or you may be the first fresh report of a beacon in your area. And for engineers, monitor 121.5 during aircraft maintenance. We do get ELTs accidentally being set off during maintenance. And a couple last obvious ones, secure your beacon when not in use. And if it happens you accidentally do activate your beacon, please do contact the JRCC immediately to let them know on that number on the slide there, 1-800-815-257. They're nice people and they will appreciate the call or heads up, particularly if that's appeared on their system, which only takes a few minutes, and they've already begun the process of activating assets. That's it for my presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Dean. Wonderful. Thanks, mate. Always good to have AMSA along with us, and they joined us up in Cairns, which was also nice. Our third speaker is Leanne Costin from Airservices Australia. She's Director of Operations of Primary Towers North. I would assume that's in the northern part of Australia. And without any further ado, I will now ask Leanne if she can assume control of the mouse and run through her presentation. I'll just hit that there. And you should now be up and running, I think, Leanne.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, I am. Hi, everybody. Yes, I certainly have Cairns Tower as one of my towers to manage. I also have Brisbane, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast. I'm actually at Sunshine Coast today, sitting in the office, so I apologise for any loud aircraft that may depart during the presentation. So I'll try to give you an ATC perspective of, so I'd like just to talk about how ATC can assist pilots once there is weather in the area, talk about the surveillance information service, radar and ADS-B, and our workload. Again, talk about the difference between request and require, and then also flight planning. Cute. So as a controller, if I go from the, looking at all sort of three perspectives, or I guess three, when I got the information for this presentation, and that was from the tower, terminal control unit, and en route controllers as well. I was an en route controller, and my last area that I worked was around Perth. So a lot of experience with the weather that comes through for Perth and how quickly it can change there. So we have, as was mentioned in the first with the Bureau of Meteorology, the information there, and we have, the same weather information there, weather radar, thunderstorm alert or warnings, cyclone tracking as well. So that's where we get our information from, and it's important, I guess, just to say that even though controller will have all that information, what we won't do is provide tracking advice based on that information. It gives us a bit of a guide, but we won't be suggesting, track by the whatever a low-level route or even some sort of topography guide, because the weather information with the delays with the internet and just the source, we may be giving you false information, giving a pilot false information. So we won't be doing that. What we can do is provide that surveillance information service to VFR aircraft or a flight following service, and I'll talk about those in the next slides. The weather reports and forecasts, which was mentioned from the Bureau of Meteorology, and then another one which provides a great source of information for ATC, which then can be provided to other pilots, is weather reports and ride reports from pilots, and I guess we usually just say aircraft in ATC, and that question of, do you have any ride reports? Yes, we do. Preceding traffic reported such and such, and that's a great source of information that can be provided to following aircraft. And then from I guess the tower perspective, and I did sort of initially based my presentation on CANS. CANS tower can, and all towers obviously, just look out the window and provide you that real-time weather advice as well. So utilise the tower there, and I guess even around the terminal control units, where they can easily just call the tower and ask for weather updates there as well. Okay, so the Surveillance Information Service, or the SIS service as we call it, is an on-request position navigation information service for VFR aircraft there, and in class Echo and Gulf airspace. Importantly, from an ATC perspective, the SIS is only provided when workload allows it, and I guess sometimes from a pilot's perspective, it may be a little bit difficult just to work out how busy a controller is. So I guess with my ATC hat on, I just say that if you do request that service and it is denied, it's usually because there will be a lot of other things going on for that controller. To utilise the service there, flights need to be direct VHF communication. And then also, very important one, equipped with a serviceable transponder or ADS-B transmitter. I have had situations where pilots were not aware that they had left surveillance coverage and requested the service. And that was, I guess, for me, the south of Perth there. So important areas, important items there to remain mindful of, I guess. And then also, very importantly, with that SIS service, when you are receiving it, that the responsibility for aircraft and terrain avoidance remains with the pilot. So when the service is not available, these slides, I should just sort of say, that comes out of MATS, Annual Air Traffic Services. So this is like the controller version, what we learn when we are training. If you're unable to provide the SIS, advise the pilot when unable to provide, and that could be on a request and say actually not available due workload, or you may actually have to terminate the service due to a change in workload or something for the controller. So prior to providing the SIS, we will identify the aircraft, and unless the service requested is of a short duration, and that's that one-shot kind of service, we will allocate a discrete code if we feel that the service is going to continue on, or if we're going to, I guess, near ATC boundary, so an airspace boundary, and we're going to what we call it, hand you over to another controller. So if it is a snapshot service, just that all we're providing is, just a traffic information service for that exact period in time, and then that will stop. So consider the pilot request for specific information as a snapshot service, not an ongoing service, and then we terminate the SIS after providing the requested information. So we'll go through you call us, we identify you, we might give you a code if there's a lot of traffic in the area, just so that we get that positive identification, give the traffic snapshot, try to fulfill any other requests that you may have, and then we will terminate the service. Thank you. Then we also have flight following, and that's that ongoing service. So you will, you will be provided with a code there, a discrete SSR code, and again, from an ATC perspective, it is a sector by sector. So if I'm sitting on whatever sector I'm controlling, and it may suit me to provide that flight following service, the controller on the adjoining sector may be too busy, maybe their weather situation is much different to mine. I'm sitting, after the weather's gone through, or maybe just before, but the person sitting next to me could be very busy with, a front or a storm or something coming through. So it's provided on a sector-specific basis, and then when a pilot requests a handoff, so you're coming up to a boundary, you need to change to a different area frequency. The pilot requests a handoff, then there may be a delay in there as the controller then goes and coordinates to the next controller, the identification, and to transfer to the adjacent unit. And then again, the ongoing service is dependent on the workload of the controller in the adjacent unit. So with the terminating of the service, we may terminate it at any time based on workload or on pilot advice. So you may actually request for the service to be terminated. We will terminate by advising you identification is terminated. And if it is at a boundary, then also advise that the frequency change is approved, because we no longer require you on our frequency. So radar and ADS-B, radar obviously down the J curve and around the terminal units. And I just did it, I guess, again from a CANS perspective, and interesting there with ADS-B that the mountains there down to the west of the tower there do affect the ADS-B coverage. And the other, I guess, with ADS-B, and encourage everybody to have it, is that when radars do go off for maintenance or out of service, whether it be due just regular service or maintenance schedule, or the other thing with radars is they can really be affected by heavy rain, hail, and probably not going to get snow in the wet season, but yeah, the weather can affect the transmission of the radar, so the ADS-B will help out there as well. I was very proud of that picture that I took just by accident. I obviously meant to take the picture, but didn't realise I would be presenting in Cairns, and that was flying into Cairns a few months earlier this year. And it was a good example just of how those clouds do form on the mountains. And I guess whether it's Cairns or anywhere else, that that mix of weather and topography can cause, I guess, increased workload and dangerous situations. Yep, so the ATC workload, and we've all kind of mentioned whether it's the Bureau with their increased workload, AMSA with increased search and rescue, that workload for ATC has also increased. So we're all, throughout weather, everyone's workload is increased. And the other thing, especially for ATC, is that we have that systemic safety built in to our airspace, to our procedures, and weather diversions takes that away from us. So routes that are usually separated, whether they be the rocket routes between Melbourne and Brisbane, or up to Cairns as well. As soon as aircraft are taken off their one-way routes, then what we had as separated routes no longer are. So that increases the workload. Again, with SIDS and STARS in and out of aerodromes, maybe with the height requirements that there is a thunderstorm or a cell straight off the runway, so you're not going to be able to climb directly out, or climb in wherever the the SID takes you, with those height requirements to get you over the top of the inbound star, or the star coming in and you have to meet a requirement to get underneath the departing aircraft. So again, that strategic separation is taken away. There's also the increased chances of go around and missed approaches, which then again puts you in conflict with either aircraft that have just departed, as is often a big difference in speeds there, but also possibly into conflict with aircraft that are arriving but then diverting around weather in the area. With our training for each sector, we are always aware of the hotspots of each airspace, and what is a hotspot, or a known area of conflicts, or just tricky situations. That can change once weather's involved as well, because again, aircraft are flying in all sorts of different routes, different positions than they normally would. And all of this really does apply to both a VFR aircraft flying relatively low and right up to RPT flying around at 30, 40,000 feet. So I guess I've probably touched on most of this with our workload. So our situational awareness, needs to be heightened. So does the pilot, so does everybody, because things are different. We also have a lot of increased internal coordination between controllers. So while it may sound quiet on the air, in the background, I may be telling the controller sitting next to me that the flight that would not normally be going through their airspace is now about to divert through their airspace, whether that's high level or low level as well. And sorry for the noisy Virgin aircraft outside. The other interesting one is that the third last dot point there, that all aircraft want to track through the same clear piece of airspace. So as soon as you find that clear piece where you might think, great, off I go through there, but so does everybody else. So that often makes for tricky separation there, where vertical separation really is our only option there, because we don't have the space for lateral separation. Outside control area, with aircraft being taken off their usual routes, that may cause increased traffic to be passed to other aircraft that wouldn't normally be within the traffic parameters for outside control area. And then just in general, that extra comms between pilots and ATC, just on requests, requirements, reporting back on track, and that I guess those sort of that constant chit chat that increases with unusual situations. Thank you.
And request versus require. I touched on this a little earlier, Leanne, if you can just briefly give us a rundown.
I guess the summary of that is, if you really, really do require something, use the word require.
Yep.
And we will, it makes a big difference to ATC. So a request is, yep, we'll do our best to get it. Require, we will make sure that you get what you are requiring, whether it be a specific runway for departure or arrival, a specific route, even down to, I require heading whatever to remain clear of clouds or other, weather, which probably takes me to that last dot point there, that ATC phraseology for outside control area versus in CTA is that when we're talking about headings, we will say suggested heading outside control area, because we can't put you on a specific heading. And then inside control area, where you are being controlled and you will be given the specific heading. So sometimes when you do pilot requests, request a diversion, you're 10 miles left to track. For separation with other aircraft, we may actually say fly heading and a specific heading to give that positive separation that's required.
Alrighty.
And just mindful of time there, submit a flight plan. If there's a plan in the system, it does make it so much easier for ATC to match you up in the system and get your flight flying in our computer system, in the tax system. And it does increase ATC workload of trying to enter it to feed the beast, as we say, to get everything in there.
Yeah.
We can jump to the last one there.
Yeah, and that's that.
Yeah. So I guess in summary, and another 10 points for anyone who can see where that, or have a guess where that aerodrome is in southeast Queensland earlier this year. Be prepared, know the weather, and if you're having any troubles, call ATC as soon as possible and let us know that, you know, whether you're on cloud, about to go into cloud, something like that. And always be mindful that weather creates an increased workload for both pilots and ATC. Thank you.
That's great, Leanne. Oh, is that Coolangatta?
Yes, it is.
Just a very quick question. Someone's just put on the chat. There's only patchy ADSB coverage below 10,000 feet in the Kimberley. So is flight following really possible there? And will the coming SBAS system change that?
So flight following probably not, or for that outside surveillance. And I guess again, was that
SBAS?
SBAS, yeah. So I guess again, depending on where it goes as well. So it's not going to provide, I don't think, that full coverage. And of course, we need to also get that into our system as well. So into Airservices, I guess taking it into our systems as well.
All right.
But it will be a great improvement.
Thanks, Leanne. Wonderful. I'm now going to flick on to Jason. Jason's our last presenter. He's our industry subject matter expert of all things wet season flying. He's had many wet seasons under his belt, as I said, from flying small single engine piston aircraft all the way up to the Challenger 604, all through northern parts of Australia, the Gulf country and PNG and all the rest of it. So Jason, I will now give you control of the device and hand over to you. Thanks, mate.
All right, thank you, Tim, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'll just figure out if I can actually move these slides for starters.
There you go. Beautiful.
Okay, yep, we're going. All right. So yeah, as Tim said, I'm currently captain with Cobham on the AMSA contract in Cairns. I've been a pilot for 27 years, and in that time, been operating in Northern Australia, PNG, and the Solomon Islands. So really, this afternoon, I was just going to have a quick chat about my career, some of the things I've experienced along the way, lessons I've learned, and just maybe some tips and tricks for you. So the first sort of flight that I was going to talk about, I'm basically at this point a bare commercial pilot with about 200 hours, and this is a VFR flight in a 210 from Townsville up to Maritime, and the job was just basically to take two people from Townsville to Maritime. It was in the wet season, and look, when I got out of bed in the morning, I knew it wasn't going to be a great day weather-wise. Drove to work, jumped on the phone, ordered my weather through the AvFax service. As the weather came rolling off the fax machine, it was pretty clear that the coast route for that flight was pretty much out due to the weather. Out to the west didn't look too bad, but it still wasn't fantastic. So at this point, made the decision to just sort of put the brakes on and just sit on the ground for a while. My two passengers weren't overly impressed with that idea, and there was a little bit of pressure from the operator as well to sort of get going and take these people to where they needed to go. Monitored the weather throughout the day, decided about lunchtime that it didn't look too bad. So off we went in a 210 it was. We went out through Thornton's Gap and we tracked up towards Maritime. Started off not too bad. The cloud was low and there were a few showers about, but it was okay as far as VFR flying goes. As we moved to the north, you know, the cloud got lower, the showers got more frequent, and things got a lot harder. Basically, out to the west was fine. That was kind of my escape plan that I had at that time. But things got a bit dicey. I would say marginal VFR, a lot of ducking, weaving, and high workload, high stress levels. Not really where I should have been for a pilot with that amount of experience. I did manage to sort of work my way into the back of the tablelands and land at Maritime. A few mistakes made that day though, and really probably the most important one was I should have just stayed on the ground in Townsville. There's a few points that I wanted to raise. So yeah, should I go or not? That can be a difficult decision for low time pilots. We put pressure on ourselves sometimes as new guys. There's pressure sometimes from your passengers, from your operator. There is pressure there, but I guess the key point here is that the final responsibility for the flight rests with the pilot in command. So it's not up to your ops manager or your chief pilot, it is up to the pilot in command. And if there's any doubt and uncertainty, then the best option is just stay on the ground. And that's what I should have done on this day that I've just talked about. For me then, I went up to New Guinea after that. This is late 90s. I worked for a company called Airlink. And the next flight I was going to talk about was in a Cessna 404 from a place called Hoskins to Candrian, which is in the islands out to the east of New Guinea. I'd done 2 of these flights already for the morning. The weather seemed pretty good. There was nothing unusual. Landed back in Hoskins and thought that I'd actually finished for the day, and out comes the dreaded baggage trolley with the cargo boy telling me he wants me to do 1 more flight. So I was pretty excited about that prospect, and there were a few terse words used. And anyway, basically asked for standard fuel, and off I went to try and find some lunch. Not a lot of thought went into the weather at that point. It was just the 3rd trip for the day, and I wasn't expecting anything different. So off we went out of Hoskins, departed visually and tracking out across the mountains there, some quite high country. So there were starting to become some build-ups evident across the mountains. Managed to kind of divert left and right of track visually around the weather and land at Candrian. Not too many problems there. Once on the ground at Candrian, things kind of went a bit haywire. There was about 20 people wanting to get on an aeroplane that could only take about 8. So that took a good part of an hour to resolve. And anyway, after we finally got that sorted out, loaded up the passengers, departed, turned left and set course for Hoskins, and I just kind of looked up at this basically this wall of grey in front of me with bits of lightning bolts flying out of the side of it, left, right, and centre. And the passenger behind me in row 1 sort of got me by the t-shirt and giving it a little tug, pointing in front of the aeroplane, going, you know, look. So it didn't look good. And what amazed me on that day was just how quickly it changed. You know, in the hour that we'd been on the ground at Candrian, it had gone from a few build-ups to basically, you know, fully developed thunderstorms. And even though we were IFR that day, couldn't sort of see a way through with the weather radar, so we diverted about 74 miles to the right of track before we managed to find a gap that we could get through, and fly back to Hoskins, where we made a normal approach and landing with a less than ideal amount of fuel. So again, there was a few lessons here. Thunderstorms, they can develop extremely quickly. And you may need to make large diversions to get around lines of thunderstorms. So if you're expecting large diversions, then you need extra fuel. Just on diversions too, the sooner you make the decision to divert around weather, the less track miles you're going to fly and the less amount of fuel you're going to burn. You will not outclimb a developing thunderstorm. Okay, so your only option here is to divert around the weather. Next flight, I've sort of graduated now to the Bandarani, which was a turboprop, unpressurised turboprop. This is an IFR flight from an island called Nissen to Tokyo. 2 crew, and essentially departed Nissen, no issues. Diverted left a track due to the weather over New Island, which was very common. Diverted over the weather on New Island out to the south of New Island, and then we carried out a DME arrival into Tokyo. It also sort of made it a bit more of a friendly approach as well. It's quite high terrain over New Island. The weather on approach on the arrival itself wasn't too bad. We got visual quite early in the piece. As we got visual, sort of looked out to the airfield and we could see just looked like a light shower of rain that was just starting to cross the runway 28 threshold. We made a decision to fly a quick circuit and land on runway 10 before the weather before the shower rain really passed over the field. So what happened? We flew our circuit, turned base, final. We were getting a little bit of light rain on the windscreen, and then all of a sudden we just got heavy tropical rain on the windscreen. Lost all visibility, and we had to go around basically and hold out to the north of the airfield for about 15 minutes before we landed. So there's a couple of things there. Don't rush your approach. You're better off to hold. I think someone said it earlier, you know, tropical weather moves in and out very quickly. So sometimes 10, 15 minutes is all you'll need, and the weather will move away. Light tropical showers can quickly turn into a heavy rain shower. So you get heavy rain on your windscreen. I know these things are designed to clear rain, and some of them have got beautiful windscreen wipers as well. But quite often the rain just seems to sit on the windscreen, and you can't see anything. So important to keep your windscreens clean. I know that sounds ridiculous, I'm sure, but keep them clean. Rain-X, there's also that stuff is magic in the wet season. The rain just clears straight off your windscreen. You'll see a whole lot more. Next one I've got for you here is I'd moved back to Australia at this point on the Dash 8 with Coastwatch, and this is just a routine maritime surveillance flight, Weeper for Weeper, out to the north. These flights are quite long, and the idea is you stay out there as long as you possibly can before returning to your destination. The weather wasn't fantastic this day. Horn Island pretty much needed an alternate all day. The Torres Strait looked horrible from where we were. The Cape wasn't too good either. We'd been monitoring the forecasts for Weeper pretty much every 30 minutes when we make a position report. We were checking the weather just to see what was going on, looking for trends. Really, that was probably the most important thing. Throughout the day, the body of the TAF for Weeper was okay. There was 60 minutes holding required, which we had. I did hear sort of towards the end of our flight, I heard a Qantas Dash 8 miss out on an approach into Weeper and diverted back to Cairns, which got my attention. At that time, we had enough fuel to go back to Weeper and then on to Cairns as our alternate. Checked the weather once more, still legally only a 60-minute holding requirement. So we made the decision then to stick with the legal requirement, which was 60 holding. At the end of our flight, we went off surveillance and transited high level back to Weipa. As soon as we got in VHF radio contact, we get a call from ATC going, "Oh, would you like the amended TAF for Weipa?" We sort of look at each other and go, "I'm not sure if we want it or not, but yeah, we'll have it." And sure enough, the body of the TAF had the weather below the alternate minima. At that point in the flight, we didn't have Cairns as an alternate. We had our 60 minutes holding for Weipa, and I can tell you it took 2 approaches and 45 minutes before we could actually land in Weipa. The weather was atrocious actually, and it was just set in across the Cape and the Torres Strait. That brings me to my next point there, I guess, is that the Torres Strait and the Cape, you can get very widespread heavy rain, low cloud. Look for the trends in the weather. You know, if you're on a long flight or even just throughout the day, when you're updating your weather, look at the trend, look at what's actually happening. Listen to what other aircraft are doing. You know, you can build a picture of what's happening by listening to what other aircraft are, whether they're landing or not landing or holding, diverting, etc. And sometimes having a good alternate is your best option, basically. There was a bit of doubt on this flight, and what we should have done in hindsight was just carry Cairns as our alternate. So if the doubt exists, just go with the safest option, and you can't go too wrong. As we've sort of already alluded to here, this afternoon, thunderstorms are probably the biggest threat of the wet season. And yeah, flying in the thunderstorms is dangerous. So the only real strategy that we have as pilots is to avoid the thunderstorm. It sounds quite simple. So how do we avoid thunderstorms? Well, we want to keep a overall update of the Met situation, including the forecast and reports. So have the big picture sorted. I heard a nice little line the other day: 1 peep equals 1,000 sweeps, and that's so true. If you're visual and you're flying visually, then to visually manoeuvre around the weather is much easier than trying to use weather radar. Obviously, if you're AMSA or nighttime, then you are forced into using weather radar. When you do finally get onto that aircraft that's got weather radar, you'll look at it and go, "Wow, that looks fantastic. How do I use it?" Well, that's what happened to me anyway, so I'm not sure what it's like these days, but basically when you get it on an aircraft with a nice weather radar, it's kind of up to you to do your research. There's plenty of information online these days that you can get on the theory behind weather radar. Get a hold of the manual for your weather radar and just get familiar with it. Practice using it in VMC conditions if you can. Just want to reiterate though, the best way to avoid thunderstorms is visually, without a doubt. So learn all about your modes, theory, limitations, and practice using your weather radar and VMC. So you know, when you can see outside what the weather's doing, cross-reference that with the picture you're seeing on your weather radar, so that when you are night or IMC, you have some idea of what you're flying into. Tilt and range, probably 2 of your most important selections that you can make with a weather radar. And yeah, just keep up a bit of a knowledge bank of what worked and what didn't for you. Okay, so for us, I guess now I'm at AMSA now. Well, not AMSA, but Cobham on the AMSA contract. We've got a big area that we we cover. So at the beginning of our shift, the first thing we'll do is gain a whole bunch of information from the Bureau of Met site, charts, etc., sat pictures. So the first step is in your planning really is to build a good picture of the general weather. Next is your TAFs. So you obviously want to look at your departure alternate, en route alternates, arrival, and your arrival alternate. Important to check the forecast over a period of time. So don't just look at the current time. You look at the current time, look at the previous 4 hours, and your ETA plus a couple of hours. So again, it's all about sort of looking for trends really. If you start seeing species or TAF amended, then that should be a bit of a red flag saying things are changing. What is changing, and have a closer look to as to what is actually changing. So yeah, this is back to what we do on the 604. So most of our flights are normally planned cans for cans. We look at the forecast and the actual weather, actual wind and weather at the planned aerodrome. Do they meet the legal requirements? If the destination wind or weather is marginal, have we got the holding fuel? Is the forecast weather for the planned use aerodrome likely to result in ATC delays? So what I mean by that one is if Cairns, for an example, you can have 30 minutes holding and you'll get 4 or 5 aircraft holding for sometimes up to 30 minutes. Not everyone can land instantaneously, so you might want to consider a bit of extra fuel to fit into a sequence after some holding. I touched on this one. If there's any en route weather or conditions that are likely to result in the additional fuel burn, so deviating around thunderstorms. In-flight icing is another one. The tropics, I know a lot of people think you can't really get ice up here. Well, you can. In particular, in a pressurised turboprop aeroplane, you're going to at times pick up heaps of ice, which means you might have to fly lower, which means you might burn more fuel. When you get into some complex fuel calcs, the old mud map is just a simple way to make sure you've got everything correct. So this is basically a takeoff into bad weather. The last thing we would do is hit the update button on NAPES and make sure we put our latest weather. Prior to start taxi, we use the BOM radar loop just to build a picture of what's happening. There is a lag between that radar site and what you're actually getting, but it's good for building a picture. We can use weather radar on taxi. Sometimes a change of runway is a better option. You know, if you've got weather sitting off the end of the departure runway, not much wind, maybe the other runway is a better option. Ask other aircraft for reports of weather. Another thing we do sometimes is just ask for a delay on the runway prior to takeoff, and we can use the weather radar to tilt up to the area that we actually want to look at, and just assess the weather before we take off. And then a final check would be make sure everything's lined up. Your PFD, heading, flight director, everything is aligned and ready to depart.
Yeah, and I love this next slide. It's just pure geometry, but gee, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does make a lot of sense, and it's all extra track miles is extra fuel, essentially, and so if you leave your diversions late multiple times, you're flying a lot of extra track miles, which means a lot of extra fuel. Very important to use your weather radar with the correct tilt. So you're looking at basically raindrops between flight level 180 and 250. So any higher or lower than that, and you may not get a good picture of what the weather is actually like. Make your decision to avoid weather early. If you can divert upwind, the weather typically is better upwind of a thunderstorm. Update the weather at your destination alternate and look for trends, and listen to weather broadcasts from others and also pilot reports. When we're talking minimum distances to get around weather, this is just some figures that I have. If the weather's above 20,000, then you want to be about 20 miles away from it. Between 10 and 20, 10 miles. Below 10,000, about 5 miles. And then, as Tim said there, the earlier you make the decision to divert, the less track miles you're going to fly, which is what it's all about, really.
And I think that you got one more. This is the last slide, I think.
Last one. Okay, thanks.
No,
You got to forgive my croaky voice. I'm just getting over a cold. So landing in bad weather, so prior to top descent, you want to be very clear on what it is you feel required to your ultimate. So have it written down, highlighted, just know it prior to top descent and monitor that figure throughout the approach and arrival. These days we can use the bomb radar to build a picture. Again, weather radar, range and tilt. We work those two things to get a picture of the weather. ATC and other pilots can give us really good information. Coming into Cairns is a classic. There's a star that goes over the Atherton tablelands and then down runway 33. And if you're inbound from the northwest into Cairns and it's 33, you'll quite often get that star in the afternoon, which can be challenging at times. But if you hear other aircraft ahead of you doing the same thing, then just ask, can they give you a report once they land? And that's a great way of knowing what to expect. If you're going to need to hold, then higher is better as far as fuel goes. Plan to fly an instrument approach and keep working the weather radar during arrival. So in particular, the range and tilt is probably the most important thing. And if in doubt, bug out. So you've got your fuel figure to your ultimate, and if in doubt, off you go to your ultimate that's got a good forecast. That's about it for me. Thanks for listening.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Jason. It's really nice to hear from someone who, goes out and does this stuff every day and have made their way up from flying small aircraft up to the larger aircraft. We've gone a little bit over time, or perhaps even a little bit more over time than I had anticipated. Lots of information we've been throwing at you. Another reason why we are recording this, and this will be made available. And apologies for that internet bug earlier on. They decided to do a computer restart at about 4:20, which was a bit untidy, so apologies for that. Marcus, you just made a quick comment when we were chatting with when Jason was talking to us. Marcus said the secondary threat of thunderstorms, at least for small aircraft flying into non-sealed remote strips, is actually the surface condition of those unsealed strips can very quickly go from quite acceptable to quite dangerous in a short amount of time. Something that we have to be mindful of. You might have got in there okay. Thunderstorm comes in and dumps 50 millimeters in 10 minutes, and it turns your strip into mush. Something to certainly be aware of with regards to surface conditions. And just a quick weather question, or maybe for yourself or Jason, Michael. Barry, can flying through Virga be problematic? Are there any types of insidious threats that doing that can to bring into play?
Maybe Jason as well, but just quickly from me, it depends where the Virga is located. I guess ahead of a thunderstorm, often the amble will precede. The amble is the high level cloud that precedes the main part of the storm, and we can see lightning come out of that amble, and also some hail in the high levels, not necessarily making to the ground, particularly in the tropics, but coming out of that. So you could say, well, there's some Virga associated with that. But if it's just out of a rain band, of course, I guess there's some visibility reductions at height if you are flying through Virga.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say avoid flying through Virga, basically. That's probably the safest option as far as that goes.
Yep. Okay. All right. And look, Shannon just put in something very quickly, probably for you, Jason. You mentioned Rain X as a water repellent for windscreens. Is that suitable for use on small aircraft like, 210s and 172s and the like?
I think it is. You'd have to sort of check whether that's okay these days. I'm pretty sure it is.
All right. Well, I'm glad we've actually recorded today. So this will be made available on our CASA website at the Pilot Safety Hub. I'd like to thank, first of all, our presenters, Jason, Leanne, Dean, and Michael, for their expertise. It's always good when we can partner with other agencies and subject matter experts from the field that are doing this every day. I really appreciate their time and expertise that they gave us this afternoon, and also a number of weeks ago when we did this live event up in Cairns as well. Thanks everyone for making the effort to come along today and give us your time, and we certainly look forward to bringing out some more useful stuff for people and getting that distributed far and wide throughout the industry. So thanks everyone. I hope you found the last couple of hours most valuable, and we'll see you next time.